Our first section is on the basic issues and theories uh, of lifespan psychology, also called human development, also called developmental psychology, just depending on what book you use, what college you go to, things like that. Um, so our very first chapter just introduces what what the field is, and as I said, some of the basic issues and major theories within it. Our core question or essential question for this chapter is really, how do we explain human behavior? We all try to explain our own or others' behavior, and how we do this has major implications that we'll dive into here. So one example, why are some children aggressive? How you explain that? People have very different explanations. So let's get started. Our learning objectives, explain the lifespan perspective and its assumptions about development, differentiate the periods of human development, explain the issues underlying lifespan development, and finally, identify the historical and contemporary theories impacting the field. So developmental psychology is the scientific study of constancy and change throughout the lifespan. It looks at personal characteristics, things like physical, mental characteristics, our interests, our behaviors. It is concerned with both historical and cultural impacts on our well-being, and the timing of events, such as reaching important developmental milestones, like starting a career, getting married, getting divorced, having children, things of that nature. All of these factors affect consistency and transformations in people from conception to death. The field of developmental psychology is scientific, meaning that researchers use the scientific method to carefully study the various areas of interest in human development. It is also applied. This means that the field of developmental science searches for practical improvements to people's lives. For example, the medical profession's interest in improving people's health is aided by information regarding physical development, disease, and nutrition. So it's not just research for the sake of research. It is research to specifically solve a problem or to improve conditions that currently exist. Finally, the field is interdisciplinary. This means that researchers and practitioners from many different fields have contributed to and made use of developmental science, psychology, sociology, biology, education, and medicine, just to name a few. So our class focuses on the lifespan perspective, and this was developed by Baltz. So Baltz really kind of laid down the core assumptions of the lifespan perspective, or how we see development. So development is lifelong. This means that no single age period is more significant than others in how it impacts one's life. For the longest time, the field very much focused on studying children. But now we have a much more expanded view. We know that adolescence and adulthood has many important contributions to our development as well. We definitely don't stop developing after childhood. Development is also multi-directional. This means that we experience both gains and losses in different areas throughout our development. It is multidimensional. That means that within each period of development, change occurs in 3 general dimensions or domains. And these are physical, cognitive, and psychosocial. The dimensions overlap and they interact, although we do tend to talk about them separately for the sake of clarity. So the physical domain includes changes in body size, proportions, appearance, functioning of the bodily systems, our perceptual and motor capacities, as well as physical health. The cognitive development refers to changes in intellectual abilities, including our attention span, memory, academic and everyday knowledge, problem-solving skills, imagination, creativity, and language development. Psychosocial refers to the changes in emotional communication, our self-understanding, our knowledge about other people, interpersonal skills, friendships, intimate relationships, moral reasoning, and behavior. Our next assumption about lifespan psychology is that the field is multidisciplinary. As mentioned before, many fields of research contribute to developmental science as well as benefit from developmental science. Fifth, it is highly plastic in that we have the ability to change, and many of our characteristics are malleable like clay. So our environment and our experiences shape us over time. We're not set in stone, right? We can change, we are flexible. Finally, development is multi-contextual. This means that many contexts influence our development. Our three major contextual influences are normative age-graded influences, normative history-graded influences, and non-normative influences. I'll also talk about some of our other major contexts, which is our socioeconomic status and culture. So first off, those influences. The normative age grade influences are the events that are strongly related to our age and therefore fairly predictable in when they occur and how long they last. These are especially prevalent in childhood and adolescence when biological changes tend to be more rapid and cultures impose many age-related experiences to ensure that young people acquire the skills they need to participate in their society. Some examples include learning to walk, talk, go to school, puberty, things like that. Normative history grade influences are the forces that are unique to a particular era, such as wars, periods of economic prosperity or depression, and changing cultural values. These influences explain why people born around the same time, called a cohort, or maybe you've heard the term generation, tend to be alike in ways that often set them apart from people born at other times. So whether you're a baby boomer, a millennial, or Gen Z, you tend to have some similar backgrounds because of certain normative history grade influences that were occurring while you've been developing. The non-normative life influences are irregular, unpredictable events that happen to just one or a few people, as opposed to, an entire generation or a particular age group like the previous ones. So because non-normative influences don't follow a particular timetable, they're very difficult for researchers to study. So these can include things like learning to play an instrument, losing your parents at a young age, being adopted, things like that are not nearly as common as what we term normative influences because they happen to such large groups. Our other two contexts that I want to make sure we talk about, and we will continue to talk about throughout this course, is socioeconomic status. This is a way to identify people based on shared levels of education, income, and occupational prestige. Even though there are differences person to person, there also tend to be several similarities across members of a social class, such as general health, foods you eat, parenting styles, stressors, religious preferences, and other aspects of daily life. For example, people living below the poverty level usually have poorer general health and a shorter life expectancy due to having a poor diet, less health care, greater stressors, and working in more dangerous occupations, as well as other factors. Last but not least is culture. Plays a very important, it's a very important context for our development. Culture refers to the totality of our shared language, knowledge, material objects, beliefs, behaviors, and values. Because we grow up immersed in our own culture, we tend to believe our own culture's practices and expectations are right, or normal compared to others. And this belief that one's culture is superior to others is called ethnocentrism. And this can be very problematic if it prevents us from trying to understand other cultures, from trying to have empathy. And so we really want to strive to have cultural relativity. Cultural relativity is an appreciation for cultural differences and the understanding that cultural practices are best understood from the standpoint of that particular culture. This is a critical aspect of development that has been neglected in the past, but is now being studied more in depth to better understand which features of development are more culturally based. In the United States, central values include things like independence, self-reliance, and the privacy of family life. And that makes the public reluctant to endorse government-supported benefits for all families. Co-cultures that occur within the US are groups of people with beliefs and customs that differ from those of the larger culture. We can generally differentiate cultures or societies as being either more collectivistic or more individualistic. And we have a handout that goes into several examples comparing the two. So collectivistic societies are ones in which people tend to define themselves more as part of a group and to stress group goals over individual goals. So people very much see themselves as interdependent. So the culture tends to stress social harmony, obligations and responsibility to others, particularly the family, and to encourage collaborative endeavors. And cultures that fall more on the collectivistic end of the spectrum are a lot of the Asian cultures, China, Japan, India, several of the African cultures, and several of the Central and South American cultures. So a lot of the Latin cultures do have more of that collectivistic emphasis on the interdependent self. As I said, especially with the good of the family taking precedence over the goals of the individual. Individualistic cultures, on the other hand, are like the United States, where people tend to think of themselves as more separate entities, as an independent self. So emphasizing things like personal exploration, discovery, personal achievements, and individual choices. So much more concerned with personal needs than group goals, generally speaking. And so which emphasis a culture has plays a major role on a nation's approach to protecting its citizens' well-being. So things like our public policies, our laws, how that impacts healthcare, childcare, vocational training, elder care, things like that are very much impacted by those public policies, which are in turn influenced by general cultural values. Some other countries besides the US that are more on the individualistic end of the spectrum, a lot of Western European countries like Great Britain and Canada, Australia, some of the other countries that are more on the individualistic end of the spectrum. And it is a spectrum, It's not like one country is 100% collectivistic or individualistic. And we also have to be careful to recognize that people within a culture do not necessarily are not necessarily as individualistic or collectivistic as every person within a single society, right? Always got to be careful when we make these generalizations about groups because we lose the view of a person as an individual, and that is definitely important to take into account as well. The age periods of development. Our class and our textbook is basically organized according to the following periods of development. I mean, we have kind of our intro chapter, and then we also have our last chapter, which is death and dying, which isn't on here, but the rest of them are on here. So we start with prenatal development, then move into infancy and toddlerhood, those first few years of life, early childhood, which is roughly 2 to 6, middle and late childhood, which is about 6 until the onset of puberty, which is roughly 12 years of age, adolescence, the beginning of puberty until age 18. This textbook and some others recognize the stage of emerging adulthood, which starts at 18 and lasts until about 25. Excuse me. Early or established adulthood then follows, and typically that starts at about 25 until 40 to 45. Middle adulthood goes from 40 to 45 until about 65, and then late adulthood, 65 and up. And as I said, we also end with the chapter on death and dying, which can actually, of course, occur at any age period, but typically occurs in late adulthood for most people, especially in more developed countries, having more access to healthcare and things like that. So going back to that scientific aspect of developmental science, the major tool of research is the theory. And the term theory is often used loosely in everyday conversations to refer to ideas or beliefs that one has about why something occurs. So an explanation for behavior. These personal, I call them quote unquote theories, personal theories, right? They're not put through rigorous scientific testing. So when we talk about theories in science, it means a set of integrated, orderly statements that describes behavior, explains behavior, and allows us to predict future behavior. So theories in science must be logically sound. They can't contain contradicting statements. They can't contradict scientific observations. And they have to allow us to draw testable predictions or hypotheses. So one example, the theory of gravity. The theory of gravity explains why objects fall to the ground when you release them from a particular height, why the same object weighs a different amount if we were to go to different planets or on the moon, things like that. And I can make testable predictions based off of this theory, right? I can predict that if I drop a pen, it will fall towards the ground, right? And then I can test that to see if my prediction holds true. So theories, they're very helpful to us, but they're definitely not everything. I do want to mention though, they are very different from opinions and beliefs because their continued existence depends on scientific verification. So this means using a fair set of research procedures agreed on by the scientific community, and the results must be replicated over time, right? Not just one study. Multiple studies need to have the same result. Verified theories provide a solid basis for practical action that can help improve lives. There are many theories in the field of developmental science because researchers do not always agree on the meaning of the results of a study, and because humans are very complex and dynamic. No single theory has been able to explain all of the physical, emotional, cognitive, and psychosocial changes that humans undergo. So each of the theoretical perspectives emphasize somewhat different aspects of development, steers developmentalists in particular directions, and continues to evolve as new research is conducted. Each theory starts with different assumptions about development, and they take their own stance on several issues. And we call these the basic issues in development. So the first one is the relative influence of nature versus nurture. Nature refers to genetic or biological factors. Nurture refers to environmental influences and the experiences that we have. So are genetic or environmental factors more important to one's development? In truth, both are, but how much? That's where developmentalists, different theorists, right, have various opinions. So it's not so much, one or the other, but rather more a question of amount. So is it a 50-50 split? Is it 80% nature, 20% nurture, or vice versa? Things like that. The next big issue is development more continuous or discontinuous? So continuous refers to a process of gradually improving the same types of skills that were there to begin with. The difference between immature and mature is one of amount or complexity. So this view emphasizes quantitative measures, quantity being kind of the root of quantitative. So looking at number, amount, frequency, anything we can assign a numerical value to, essentially. So this view is like a gentle slope of a hill, in which, again, we're essentially the same, and it's just going from immature to mature is one of amount or complexity in terms of our skills. And you can see the sapling to the immature tree to a more mature tree in the picture there. Discontinuous is like the bugs there. So the discontinuous view, seeing development as a process in which new ways of understanding and responding to the world emerge at specific times. So these are where the stage theorists will fall on that discontinuous side of things, seeing development as a particular spot and then having this kind of quick jump or spurt of development of maturity, followed by another period of general stability, another spurt, so on and so forth. This view emphasizes qualitative differences, with quality being the root word there, meaning fundamental difference in terms of how we see and experience the world. So infants and children having very unique ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving compared to teenagers, compared to adults. Again, very much taking place in stages that have to be completed in a particular order. And so you can see the egg followed by the pupa, the larva, and then the mature ladybug, or I might have mixed up pupa and larva. Not an entomologist here, psychologist. The next big issue that the theories have their own perspectives on, active versus passive. So this means that some theorists see people as having more control over their development, and others believe that our development is more influenced by our genes and our environmental conditions, and we take a passive role. So a lot of things outside of our control shaping our development, as opposed to our own choices and actions leading development. Last but not least, stability versus change. So certain theorists emphasize how we remain similar from infancy to adulthood, seeing as our traits rooted in behavioral and emotional tendencies that we have um, when we're very young. Others emphasize how we differ as we age, noting that our initial tendencies can be impacted by social and cultural forces over time. Theorists who emphasize the stability of individual characteristics usually stress the importance of heredity or our genes, um, whereas those who emphasize the changes in development often emphasize the importance of environment and experience. So that stability versus change very often reflects the views of the nature versus nurture issue. Take a minute and think about where you stand on the issues. So let's look now at the historical theories that started the field. So first up, preformationism, the belief that a tiny, fully formed human was implanted in the sperm or egg at conception. This was the major theory back in the 1700s. Children were very much seen as mini adults, and that their development occurred due to a set schedule with no influence from the environment. John Locke, however, disagreed with this view. He was a proponent of a term that he came up with, tabula rasa, meaning blank slate. So his view is that we come into the world as these blank slates, and our environment and our experiences fill in these slates, make us who we are. His view, his theory, laid the work for behaviorism, for people like Pavlov, Skinner, and Bandura, and learning theory in general. Jean-Jacques Rousseau also disagreed with preformationism's idea of kids as little adults, but rather than blank slates, Rousseau believed that their development occurred due to their biological maturation and that children should be allowed to think and develop according to their own timetable rather than being forced to develop by adults, by older individuals. Rousseau is considered the father of developmental psychology, and his point of view strongly influenced Giselle, Montessori, Piaget, individuals like that. Speaking of Giselle, Arnold Giselle studied children's neuromotor development at Yale University. He believed children's development was activated by genes and occurred in fixed sequences. Similar to Rousseau, he believed children shouldn't be taught ahead of schedule, but would show the particular behavior once they had matured. He was the first to demonstrate that a child's developmental age may be different from their chronological age. So developmental age, what we expect a child of a particular age to be able to do, whether that's physically, cognitively, psychosocially, chronological age, their actual age in terms of how many years it's been since they've been born. His research provided the basis for later developmental assessment. The final historical theorist that we'll touch on is Sigmund Freud, who created the psychosexual theory of development, which emphasized that healthy personality development is determined by how parents manage their child's early sexual and aggressive drives. So we learn how to deal with our instincts in a more socially appropriate manner, essentially. While Freud was helpful in emphasizing the importance of an individual's unique life history and early experiences, he was definitely criticized for several reasons. So some of his theoretical concepts are ill-defined and untestable, things like ego functioning. He also relied on unvalidated case studies in which he didn't actually even study children to develop his theory of psychosexual development. Finally, his theory was also criticized for overemphasizing sexuality and because it was very culturally specific to the problems of repressed wealthy adults in 19th century Vienna. So that set the groundwork for the field of developmental psychology. Next, we're going to talk about the contemporary theories, the theories that we use today, right? The current, right, the most current theories. And these are also noted in our theory outline, some of the specifics there to follow along. So several of Freud's followers split off from him due to disagreements with his theory. And one of these neo-Freudians, new Freuds, was Erik Erikson. Erikson replaced Freud's emphasis on sexuality with social relationships. So instead of a psychosexual theory of development, psychosocial theory of development. He believes social relationships were the major influence of our social emotional development. Erikson also added 3 adult stages to Freud's 5 stages of childhood, believing that we must face a psychosocial crisis or challenge at each stage of development to allow us to acquire the attitudes and skills that make an individual an active contributing member of society. While Erikson's theory is useful to guide our understanding of psychosocial development, his theory has been criticized for focusing too heavily on crises, assuming that we must complete one crisis before addressing the next, and that his theory is not applicable to all cultures. Next, we move into behaviorism or learning theories. North American behaviorism began in the early 20th century with the work of John Watson, who, rejecting the psychoanalytical concern with the unseen workings of the mind, set out to create an objective science that focused on directly observable events, stimuli, and responses. Inspired by Ivan Pavlov's experiments with dogs, Watson sought to find out if classical conditioning could be used to mold children's behavior. In another form of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning theory, environmental reinforcers and punishments determine behavior. So if you're familiar with traditional learning theory or behaviorism, this is referring to classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, really the conditioning of reflexes by pairing something, a stimulus that causes an automatic response with a neutral stimulus that doesn't cause a response, at least at first. So with Pavlov's dogs, the neutral stimulus was the bell, right? The unconditioned stimulus is the meat, unconditioned meaning unlearned. We don't have to learn to, in this case, salivate, our unconditioned response, to meat, or same with dogs, same with people, right? So by pairing the neutral stimulus, the sound of the bell, with the meat, the dogs were salivating. Over time, he could present just the sound of the bell. So now it's a conditioned stimulus that causes a conditioned or learned response of salivation. This is different than operant conditioning, which very much focuses on the consequences that we receive after a behavior, either leading to an increase in that behavior or a decrease. If it leads to an increase in behavior, it's what we call reinforcers or reinforcement. If you receive a punishment, right, decrease in behavior. So classical conditioning, more those reflexes through linking to stimuli. Operant conditioning based on our voluntary behaviors, not just reflexes, and on those consequences leading to either an increase or decrease in behavior. The last theory that kind of falls under the traditional learning theories or behaviorism perspective is social learning theory, or sometimes called social cognitive theory, because they have now taken into account more of the cognitive factors. This was first developed by Albert Bandura, who promoted the idea of learning through observation of a model. So basically watching someone do something and then later imitating their behavior, copying their behavior. So this is sometimes referred to as, monkey see, monkey do, right? You see someone do something and you copy them, right? You do it as well. And this is especially likely to occur if we see that model, that person demonstrating the behavior, receive a reward, reinforcer. We're less likely to copy that behavior if we see them receive a punishment. So it is drawing on that idea of operant conditioning, but saying that we can learn vicariously, essentially. We don't have to directly receive those consequences ourselves in order to learn behavior. So the big contributions of behaviorism and social learning theory. Things like behavior modification, which is used to treat many undesirable behaviors in both children and adults, ranging from poor time management to extreme fears, phobias. The idea of the importance of modeling and observational learning. The downsides or the limitations, having a narrow view of environmental influences, so very much focusing on the nurture end of that nature-nurture debate, and underestimating an individual's contribution to their own development. Getting into the cognitive perspective, this perspective focuses on what's going on in the mind. So thinking, essentially, cognitions and thinking, and we treat them as interchangeable. So according to Jean Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, children actively construct knowledge as they manipulate and explore their world. Piaget's view of development influenced by Piaget's view of development is influenced by biological maturation. Central to his theory is the concept of adaptation. So he thought mental structures adapted to better fit with the environment. He believed our understanding, the understanding of children is different from adults. He was a stage theorist, so that discontinuous view of development, seeing that children move through 4 broad developmental stages. The sensory motor stage, where a baby uses its senses and movements to explore the world, learning to find hidden toys, where the concept of object permanence is a big achievement in that stage, which lasts from birth to 2 years. The pre-operational stage, 2 to 7, essentially preschool children and kindergarten children. This stage is characterized by symbolic but illogical thinking patterns. This is a time where children develop language and engage in make-believe play, which he saw as very important to our development. The concrete operational stage, 7 to 11 years of age, school-age children engaging in more organized logical thinking. They'll be able to organize objects into hierarchies of classes and subclasses. They'll learn the law of conservation. We'll get into all of this more as we hit those different periods of development in our chapters. His last stage, the formal operational stage, 11 and up. So kind of like Freud, just kind of looking at the first few years and then you're done, right? Well, not the first few, the first childhood, and then kind of saying, and developing, which you don't really follow anymore. So the formal operational stage, 11 and up, this is where our thought becomes more abstract, systematic. We're able to engage in hypothetico-deductive reasoning, and this happens in adolescents and adults, typically. The contributions of his work, he convinced the field that children are active learners and looked at children's reasoning about social and the physical world. If you go into early childhood education or field of education in general, you'll definitely hear Piaget's name again. The limitation of his theory, he underestimated the competencies of infants and preschoolers. Additionally, children could perform on Piagetian problems better with training, which flies in the face of his idea that you had to be at a particular biologically mature state before you could learn to solve a particular type of problem. And contrary to his theory, some lifespan theorists believe important transformations occur in adulthood as well. So today, many theorists accept the view that change is more gradual than Piaget's conceptualization. Others also emphasize more of those continuous gains in cognition and focusing on the role of social and cultural contexts in our learning. For example, Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist, he developed a sociocultural theory, which focuses on how culture is transmitted to the next generation. He believed that social interaction, especially dialogues with more knowledgeable members of society, is key for children to acquire their culture's ways of thinking and behaving. Like Piaget, Vygotsky saw children as active, constructive beings, but he also viewed cognitive development as a socially mediated process, dependent upon support or scaffolding, as he termed it, from more knowledgeable others, particularly adults, but also more expert peers in teaching another. So a big contribution of Vygotsky's theory, he's one of the first developmental researchers to recognize the importance of culture in our development. One of the major criticisms, his theory does not focus on the biological side of development and minimizes the role individuals play in shaping their own environment. Again, if you go into education, you'll definitely hear Vygotsky's name again, and we will talk about both he and Piaget in our coming chapters. Information processing theory. So information processing researchers view the human mind as a symbol manipulating system through which information flows. From the time information is presented to the senses as input until it emerges as a behavioral response at output, information is actively perceived, analyzed, manipulated, used, and remembered. So this view sees people as actively making sense of their own thinking and sees development as a, continuous process of change. A great strength of this perspective is its use of rigorous research methods, which is aided by having that more continuous quantitative focus. A limitation is it provides little insight into topics like creativity and imagination, things that are a lot harder to quantify. On our theories outline, we also mentioned cognitive neuroscience. Slide here for that. But cognitive neuroscience is rapidly expanding field devoted to better understanding how we think and behave by really studying the brain's structures and function through a lot of brain scan equipment in order to understand what's happening, within the brain when we engage in certain behaviors. And we'll talk about that repeatedly as well. So just wanted to mention that. And even though it's not like a theory necessarily, it's kind of more of a field of study. Getting into the more contextual perspective, ecological systems theory, Urie Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory views the person as developing within a complex system of relationships affected by multiple levels of the surrounding environment. So this perspective puts a heavy emphasis on environment. So many layers of the environment simultaneously influencing our development. So you see at the very center of this kind of bullseye looking model, those are the internal factors. So that's a recent addition to this theory, trying to, also take into account personal factors like your self-concept, your behavior regulation, your emotion regulation, things like that. They heavily, as I said, emphasize things that are in the environment as opposed to more what's going on in the person. So the first layer is the microsystem, the innermost level. That includes the activities and relationships in the individual's immediate surroundings. So things like family and childcare and school, things like that. Mesosystem, that's the second level, and that is the connections between different aspects of the microsystem. So for example, a child's home and school, right? During parent-teacher conferences, that would be the connection there. That would be the MESA system having an influence on our development. The next one out, the exosystem, which consists of social settings that do not contain the developing individual, but affect their experiences in the immediate settings. So, for example, if parents are working long hours, if they commute a lot, have a long commute, that's going to impact the family life, the home life of the individual, even though that developing individual is not directly in the parent's workplace. Next, the outermost is the macro system, which includes a culture's laws, values, customs, and resources. So that's where things like that collectivism, individualistic, cultural view is going to have a bigger impact. Finally, all of these levels, all of these environments take place within the chronosystem. The chronosystem is the temporal dimension or the time dimension. So things like particular historical events happening, right? Things like if you're living through a war, if you're living through a period of economic prosperity or recession, a pandemic, things like that, that's going to have an impact. This also refers to times like your age. So if you lose your job, for example, at 25 versus 45, probably going to have a pretty different impact on your development. So Bronfenbrenner states that context is ever changing and that when individuals add or let go of roles or settings in their lives, they're undergoing ecological transitions or important turning points in development. Things like starting school, entering the workforce, getting married, moving, retirement, things like that. The major contribution of this model has helped to generate a lot of research on the many levels of a developing individual's environment and how it impacts how they impact one another. And that changes at one level can ripple through, can potentially change other levels, well, they can, but also sometimes changes at one level make little difference if changes aren't also made at other levels, depending on what we're talking about specifically. The major criticism is that it's difficult to use this theory because there are so many variables. Additionally, it pays too little attention to genetic influences on development. So, by this time, you might be saying to yourself, this seems like a lot of theories. Why do we have so many? And I like to remind students that we have a lot of theories, essentially because, well, I think the poem, The Blind Man and the Elephant, kind of does a great job of noting or emphasizing why we have these different theories. Oh, I forgot to talk about the last perspective on our theories outline, the evolutionary perspective. So the view that development shaped by traits that were functional adaptations to the environment through the process of natural selection. And so essentially, if a trait gives you a survival advantage, a reproductive advantage, more likely to get passed on to the next generation. So that covers things like the theory of that comes from the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. We'll also talk about ethology, which is not a theory, but rather a field of study, which looks at animal behavior. And then finally, the field of behavioral genetics, we'll talk about that a lot in our next chapter. Pretty much it's the field that tries to parse out how much of the behavior is due to our genetics, how much is due to the environment. So they very much focus on that nature versus nurture question. So that's why I include them on that outline. But getting back to why we have so many theories. The poem, The Blind Man and the Elephant, was written by John Godfrey Sachs. It is based on an Indian fable. And it gives a great metaphor for why we have a lot of theories. So I'll read it here. It was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall. The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out an eager hand, and felt about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, e'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can. This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceedingly stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. So essentially, I like this poem because it says, if we only focus on one part of the elephant, we're not going to see the whole elephant, right? We won't get the whole picture. Same with why we have a lot of theories in developmental psychology. If we only focus on like the cognitive theories or the behavioral theories, we're not going to get the whole picture of human development. So that's why we have multiple theories. If you're starting to feel like this is a lot, humans are complicated. And so this takes us into our activity, kind of going back to that essential question of, how do we explain behaviors? Well, different theories explain behaviors in different ways. So this activity gets us to consider what or how different theorists would explain the same behavior. And again, kind of the idea that it's not just which theory is right, but rather what can we learn from each of these theories and apply it all together to increase our understanding. So this activity focused on essentially, can you match the theories with the explanations, right? So how might different developmental theorists explain why a child's aggressive? So some of them are saying things like aggression occurs because children watch others be aggressive and then imitate their behaviors. Others saying, no, it's a sign of negatively resolved childhood crises. The third saying the child needs practice and guidance from others to learn alternative responses to conflict. The fourth saying that if parents give in to their child after an aggressive outburst, they are rewarding the behavior and it will occur again more frequently. Fifth, no, children's minds need time to mature before they can think about other responses. Sixth, no, aggression is due to the child not remembering other coping skills. And number seven, aggression is influenced by many factors such as family, friends, and cultural approval for violence. So you can see each of these very different ways of explaining a behavior. And again, having a big impact on whether you see that behavior as good or bad or as something that needs to be fixed. It's going to influence how we go about changing it, if that is what we decide is appropriate, or how we might parent or influence, or how public policies or laws might even be impacted by these different explanations for a behavior. Thank you.